All right.
Excellent. I guess we're live now. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for watching REM Theory Part 3. What is Apolloism? Or rather, why Apolloism is the title. We just set up this this stream as a kind of Q&A stream because we thought that people would be interested or would have questions about or further questions about Apolloism and what the creators of this video are getting at. You may recognize my voice. I'm Mark, so you can kind of, if you're sort of familiar with the people in this circle, you know who Mark is. But we're going to answer questions from the chat. I think also Rick has some questions as well. Martin may also have some questions. But the topic is Apolloism, just as it was with the video, and maybe we'll just start out with kind of impressions of the video and what people thought. I mean, I personally am very proud of it. I think that Zorchwave is sort of the genius filmmaker behind the project. He's an editor. It's very, very outstanding work. I've edited some videos in this sphere as well, and I do pretty good. I've got some good videos out there, but I think that Zorch is kind of like head and shoulders above everyone else. I might be getting a little feedback. I don't know if maybe I'll just dump some of my screens.
Well, we can always mute when you're talking, I guess.
Yeah.
I thought, you know, having seen the video ahead of time, I mean, it's really an exciting and fast-paced video, and you cover off a lot of information in the 14 or 15 minutes of it, right? So we thought it would be a good idea to maybe have a follow-up, answer some questions, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions that people have coming out. I've already seen some questions on Twitter and all those, so those are the ones that I've written down. And, you know, we can jump into it anytime you want.
Yeah, definitely. Let's start. I mean, people can start dropping questions in the chat about the video or about the idea of Apolloism or just about my work generally. I'll field any questions about REM theory more broadly, though it is closely connected to Apolloism.
Okay. Now, if you want, I can hit you with one of the more controversial questions, I guess, that I've seen before. We can start off and jump right into that. Is that good?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. I saw this one earlier today by a Norse pagan. I will add that. Is Apolloism philo-Semitic in that a lot of credit is given to Jewish people for the creation of religion and myths? And I have heard this before, where people say, oh, you're giving Jews too much credit, or this is Semitic or that is Semitic, when really it's not. So is it philo-Semitic? Yeah,
I mean, the words anti-Semitic and philo-Semitic are kind of problematic, I guess, in their own way, right? Because, I mean, the truth is we're not, and genuinely this is the case, that we're more interested in kind of like venerating our own people, and Apollo sort of becomes a kind of one of the sort of perfect ways or perfect symbols for veneration of our own people. So, so in that way, to the extent in Judaism ultimately becomes a way of Jews kind of identifying themselves, I argue, as God, like collectively as their God. And so it is a kind of a group veneration that they're engaged in, and their God is a kind of symbol of Jewry itself, obviously. So we're engaged in something very similar. Now that doesn't make us inherently anti-Semitic or philo-Semitic. But as far as like the review of myth, which I think is what he's getting at, I give too much credit to our REM theory and myself in my work. Do I give too much credit to Jews? I would say the following. There's a couple of kind of dimensions to this answer. One is that it's not Jews per se that I'm giving credit to. It's proto-Jews, right? Which, so the answer doesn't seem facetious, and I'm being as clear as possible. I do hold to the belief that Jews have sort of been, in one form or another, from the sort of very beginnings or origins of civilization in Sumer and Egypt, just as Aryans have, so that they've existed in these kind of proto-Jewish cults is what I would call them, and that and they actually do what they reveal in their art as well, is that they sort of kind of retain a memory of that, or a kind of understanding of themselves as kind of existing in these other civilizations as these proto-Jewish groups, effectively. So what I would say to that is, I would say that, you sort of have to give the devil his due, in the sense that I think that Jews are very sophisticated in the development of culture and religion, and that is kind of their superpower to one extent or another. And that our real strength, really, as Aryans, is as founders of civilization, and as establishers of settlements, as the developers of technology. I think we excel in the field of science. In some ways, you can say that these are kind of more the, without adding too much of a value judgment to it, the sort of honest arts, as it were, that we're interested in kind of solving sort of physical and concrete problems in the world. That I think that's more our kind of, it's our sort of natural instinct, and it's also our skill set to one extent or another. But I also think that we also have the same ability that Jews have in religion, but we our sort of first instinct is against it, because we are sincerity, I guess, is, again, without adding a value judgment, Apollo, the god of truth, that's sort of more our first instinct, as it were. And the other problems of religion and art are more the problems of solving things that are psychological and that are less concrete and less sort of based in the physical world. You might even say they're in the spiritual world or in the psychological world. And you can understand psychology and the spiritual as kind of synonyms, I would argue. So they excel in that area. And then the other thing I would say is that, because one of the reasons that people think I'm giving too much credit to Jews, and there is this idea of there is what I call a bowdlerization thesis, which argues that Jews have basically kind of stolen elements from these earlier cults, and that accounts for the sort of similarities in Judaism, or the apparent references to earlier cultures or earlier cults in Judaism, is that they've bowdlerized or stolen these earlier features in it, but. And I think that is the incorrect thesis. I think the proto-Jewish thesis is the correct thesis. But one of the things that people will say, because they think that I am giving too much credit to Jews or proto-Jews, is one of the sort of the failings of their arguments is that often they're trying to protect the cults that are clearly sort of subversive cults that we wouldn't want to take credit for anyways, right? And probably the example that I use all the time is the cult of Ishtar, which was a sacred prostitution cult. Effectively, it was a kind of degenerate cult. Another very obvious example would be the cult of Bacchus or the cult of Dionysius, and that was a cult that was identified by mythographers in the ancient world with Yahweh. So I mean, this is not just sort of my invention. This is something that mythographers understood, and one person that kind of went away from that thesis incorrectly was Tacitus, and I think that led to a lot of mistakes, including mistakes that Nietzsche would make. Right. So in any case, so there's two parts of that answer. Like, one is, you have to give them credit for being sophisticated as the developers of religion and symbol, and they are an intelligent and powerful group. I mean, think how powerful they are now. Is the idea out there that we're dominated by a bunch of idiots? I mean, how flattering is that to us, right? And then the other part of that is that often people want to take credit for cults that we shouldn't be taking credit for, that are not sort of salubrious cults, that are kind of degenerate ultimately. Anyways, so right. I get a very long answer.
The only thing I would add to that is I think it's kind of a misleading judgment to view something as either anti-Semitic or philo-Semitic. It's simply an objective process, right? You're looking at what's been done and evaluating who has done it, right? And I think it's only natural that every group has evolved to, work towards their own interests, to have an in-group preference, and to advance their own interests. And, Jews are no different than Asians or anybody else. They would all be doing these things. And the methods in which they apply their interests are different, and that's exactly what's happening here. And so whether it's philo-Semitic, it is what it is, right? And or whether it's anti-Semitic, again, you're just simply drawing attention to something that you've uncovered and that's been, elaborated, right?
Yeah, it's been I've also made some kind of intelligent conclusions based on the symbol and the myth, of course, as well, because I've studied the myth and symbol very closely, and I think that I've made some important contributions to the analysis of myth and symbol. But some of the examples that I cite are examples that ancient mythographers were citing.
Right.
For example, Saturn and Bacchus would be two. I mean, that's in the record. The ancient mythographers were citing them as proto-Jewish gods, effectively. Anyways, are there other pressing questions that come up, do you think?
Yeah. Well, there's one. How does Apolloism fit in with other Hellenic religions that are currently being practiced? Now, would it be wrong to say Apolloism is more a fundamentalist application of these Hellenic religions, or is that wrong? Would you classify it as modern maybe versus traditional?
Well, to be honest with you, I have no close familiarity with the way these other sort of Hellenic revival cults are being operated, or how. I think that there is I do get a sense from some things that I hear from people who claim to be, Greek or Greco-Roman pagans. And some of the things that vary from the way that we're introducing Apolloism, and I think it is actually important that we're kind of branding it with the god Apollo, because and that's articulated in the video. He's the sort of central god of the Greco-Roman pantheon and the most important, and everything kind of flows from Apollo, as it were. But again, if people have watched the video, the sort of argument for Apolloism and placing Apollo at the very center of the cult is given. Now, the way other people practice, like one idea, for example, is, that you'll hear a lot is that, well, Dionysus, it's about the balance between Apollo and Dionysus. And it's about, achieving this balance, right? Now, I think that ultimately is a kind of incorrect analysis. As described in the video, I think ultimately Apollo, the cult of Apollo, is a kind of eugenics cult, and it was developed to rejuvenate a sort of founding stock, or to protect a gene, a genetic element that was deemed valuable for the civilization, to retain this ruling noble genetic element that was part of a kind of founding stock, part of this Hyperborean conquering stock that was now being urbanized and had to find a kind of a way to defend itself against these other cults, as it were. So that's what's different, is that Apolloism is about is a eugenics cult. It's not about people. So it is a kind of anti-Bacchanal cult in that regard, or it's an anti-Dionysian cult in that regard. And again, Dionysus was a god that was identified with Yahweh. Now, again, we're not anti-Jewish, but we're anti anything that's against us. Obviously, we'd obviously be against anything that's kind of attacking us, right? And you can make it sort of distinct. You certainly, in the ancient world, there was a kind of distinction between Judaism and the cult of Dionysus. And what you could say that the cult of Dionysus, which is also where we get Athenian theater, and that's not to say that everything in Athenian theater was proto-Jewish or Jewish or whatever. I actually, in my work, I see playwrights that appear not to have been Jewish, and that were kind of in a way criticizing or attacking the cult of Dionysus, as it were. But you can look at the Athenian theater much in the way that we would look at Hollywood today. Hollywood today is a Jewish. It is a Jewish kind of manifestation. So you could argue that Bacchus represents that face of that sort of pagan, crypto face of Jewry, as opposed to the religious, ostensibly pious face of Jewry that you see with, explicit Jews who are, in going to synagogues, or wearing, rabbis, or wearing the sort of the religious outfits, right? anyway, so that was a bit of a tangent. So what was the original question again, though, Rick? Because I feel like
whether it's I'll try to paraphrase it. And is it correct to term Apolloism as a fundamentalist version of a Hellenic religion?
I guess you could. I mean, that's one way. You could. That's one way of framing it. Sure, why not? But that's going with my premise, which I think is the correct premise, is that Apollo is the central god of the Greco-Roman pantheon, and he's a god that was developed into a cult to protect genetics, right?
Right.
So in that, yeah. So, but other people will have a different view. Other people who are trying to revive Greco-Roman cults will have a different view, and they'll have a more spiritual view, which I think is ultimately kind of incorrect view.
What are some obvious indicators of when something has been subverted? I mean, if we're talking about this as a fundamentalist religion, essentially, if we go back to the origins, right? As you've mentioned, you can see that there's some subversion that comes in over the years with the introduction of other characters and new myths and things like that. What are some obvious telltale signs when something is being subverted like that?
Well, so there is a misconception, for example, about the priestesses of Apollo, right? So we don't have a kind of clear picture as to the way the cult was conducted or how the cult manifested itself. This is a reconstruction project, as is articulated in the video. And ultimately, we're inspired by the cult of Apollo, and we're trying to take sort of the best elements that we perceive in it, and in a sensible way, constructing a religion that basically serves our interest. And that's my thesis as to the sort of the original manifestation of Apolloism. That was its purpose, to serve the gens, or to serve the familia, to protect these noble families, and to protect basically, essentially, frankly, Aryan genetics, right? But I may have kind of veered. But so, to using the example of what would be called the Pythia, right, are these priestesses of Apollo. So the general understanding that we have of these priestesses is that they were these sort of upstanding, these beautiful, noble women, often from noble families. But I don't know if, for the whole sort of duration or existence of the active cult, that changed a little bit. I think that there were also these sort of low-born women who were, good women, who were known, had a kind of virtuous reputation, were beautiful and intelligent, talented people who served as priestesses. And we can understand the value of a priestess, just like we can understand the value of a beautiful news anchor, right? Who herself represents a kind of priestess. Or we think of
Starlet.
Yeah, or someone like someone like Lauren Southern, for example, right? She's right. Well, I mean, no, but her views ultimately were not our views. They're kind of these less radical views, but she, through her, her beauty and her kind of intelligence and a general sort of presentation, she was able to attract people to certain views, right? So that's about, she becomes a kind of valuable sort of propaganda element. The priestess becomes a sort of valuable propaganda element of the cult, as it were, right?
Right.
In her case, the cult is this kind of watered down, alt-right bullshit or whatever, and that's no attack on her. Obviously, I've given her some compliments. We are in disagreement politically on some things. So I think you understand my point, that there is this value to a priestess, but at some point there is this kind of myth or sort of reputation of the priestess as a mystic, essentially. So she's in the word Pythia, in fact, is derived from the python that Apollo slays, right, at Delphi, right? He slays it, and they build the oracle there. The serpent is buried there. There's actually two serpents, as it turns out, which is kind of a key point. It's kind of, I argue, it's describing the caducean already, right, in that sort of first interaction that Apollo has with the serpents. But Python is buried underneath the temple of Apollo, and there's a crack or a fissure in the ground. And from this is the myth how it's, this is not something, obviously. I mean, there is a mythic element of it, as people will realize that this is not something that happened per se, though theoretically there could have been some sort of like recreation of this in some temple, that symbolizes it. But from the ground is emanating these fumes from Python, the rot of Python, and in fact the word Python means rot. So the rot is coming up, this fume of rot, and we could even say rot. And I think this is a kind of good understanding of that myth, is that Apollo is basically kind of slaying degeneracy when he slays the Python, because the Python is literally rot, and rot is a kind of synonym of degeneracy, right? That's literally what degeneracy means, right?
Yeah, decay and decline, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to bang out some of the comments or some of the questions from the chat.
All right. Do you want me to just finish this one point though? But
right,
so at some point, we have this understanding of these Pythia, or these priests, as these mystics who are inspired by this fume that's enchanting them as a kind of drug. It's a drug that's enchanting them, and they're basically babbling this incoherent crap that priests are then turning into prophecies, or interpreting and turning into prophecies. Now, this, when you look at the sources, this idea of like the Pythia being in this sort of trance-like thing comes after it's understood that the cult of Dionysius, the cult of Bacchus, has been established at the temple, right? So what's being described is a degeneracy. A myth is describing the cult of Apollo becoming degenerate, right? So to answer your first question, anyways, yeah.
Okay. So John Sherlock asks, when will the books be out and how many will there be?
So the first book will be out as soon as possible. It's that's something that I'm working on closely with my dear friend Richard, who you might know, Richard S., also known as Spencer for Hire. But he will be publishing the books, and he's taking a great deal of care editing these books, because these books are they're very kind of I hate to pat myself on the back, but there's a kind of breakthrough element, or there's a kind of new way of looking at myth in these books that's being developed, and so we have to kind of go over it very carefully, because there's going to be a lot of critics who are basically going to be like, this guy's full of shit or whatever, and we just have to have the thing completely locked down, and so that it is a kind of ironclad argument that's being made, and so that it does become accepted as a view of myth. Effectively, the REM theory becomes accepted, which I think it will be accepted, because I think that the examples we give are just too powerful, and we give many examples, but it also is an introduction into the theory itself. Anyways.
Okay. Next question from Non. What are your thoughts on current non-racial pagan attempts to revive Greek paganism? Is there anything they have to offer ritualistically?
Again, I'm not very closely familiar with what they're doing. I guess I think that
you know what
I think the question was a bit more about what would be any rites, ceremonial rites or rituals in Apolloism?
Yeah, well, those have to be developed. So, and this is one of the sort of frustrating things that people will find with this cult in its early form, effectively, is that there's a lot of things that still need to be done, right? So, and this was also the case with, not to make such a heady comparison as Christianity, but this was also the case at the sort of early beginnings or stirrings of Christianity. Not all the rituals of the Catholic Church, for example, had been established, the moment that Christ had been nailed to a cross, for example, right? So these are things that have to be established. And what REM theory offers is a way of creating religion in a coherent way, creating art and religion in a coherent way. And it's doing it transparently, so that people who are sort of these well-intended people who are interested in developing religion that has a religion in art that has a salubrious effect on their people will be able to, once they understand REM theory, they'll be able to develop ritual. They'll be able to develop parable. They'll be able to develop, sculpture and art and film in a symbolically coherent manner that is moralizing to their people, and that's ultimately this. That's ultimately REM theory, is that this is the sort of the high purpose of religion, is to moralize and ameliorate your people, to make them, fecund, to make them moving in a eugenic direction, and to make them moralized and eager for life and excited for life, to conquer the world, to conquer the universe. And that's obviously not only in, sort of violent or martial ways, obviously not. In fact, ideally, we would do it in non-martial ways. But of course, we would also defend ourselves in instances where we could or had to defend ourselves, right? In any case, but yeah, so it's in an early phase, and it's not worth going into the details. I mean, we've already discussed some rituals that would be involved with Apolloism, but they're kind of in a kind of immature state right now, and we at some point that will be developed, and I will make my contribution to that and give my sort of ideas or recommendations for what I think would be good rituals, and also in terms of like what are the myths that we should consider canonical myths, and the myths that we should consider non-canonical or degenerate myths, even myths developed from a proto-Jewish perspective, for example. And those things, I'm not like a book burner in the sense that I think that those things should be retained, but they should be retained alongside analysis that is kind of explaining what the myths mean, right? So one example might be, and I actually kind of like the idea that we wouldn't destroy cathedrals, for example, but we would like reinvent cathedrals as like temples of Mercury, or and just say, or temples of Adonis even, and make them sort of museums where people can go and learn basically Roman interpretation and learn what the sort of goal or design of Christianity was, and how Christianity operated and functioned, so that we can look at it. We have a kind of cult preserved that we can look at and study, and thereby understand what is subversive when new cults, or when new subversive cults are developed. And we can, I think you understand my point, so that Christianity has scholarly value, but it has to be looked at from the correct perspective as something that was effectively adversarial and not interested in, in the interests of the Aryan race, for example, which I think even a lot of Christians in the dissident right, for example, would admit that it's not, even people on the right would be like, yeah, well, that's not the purpose. It's got a higher transcendent whatever. But they would argue against the idea that it was adversarial to the interests of whites or Aryans, which I think is incorrect, of course.
Well, I think we could do a whole Q&A video just on the subject of Christianity, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we'll return. I don't know that we'll re-premiere the other video based on Christianity, but we could do like a discussion about that video like this. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay, another question. Steve Lauder asks, how would other forms of Apollo, like those found in the Celtic myths, be integrated into the broader project?
Yeah, well, so I think that we're actually in the Celtic pantheon. There's more. I think that there's more that is kind of valuable to us in the Celtic pantheon, and I think that I do actually think that there are valuable elements of Norse myth as well, and I'll go into that in a second as well. But effectively in Celtic myth, we find local names of Apollo, like names like, I think Belenus is one. I think Granus is another one. And we find temples. We find temples that are earlier than any of the rune stones that we find that we connect with Norse mythology. For example, we find them in Europe among the in areas in Germania and in France and in Gaulish territories, as it were. So we see the presence of Apollo earlier. But that's actually kind of true to the thesis the film that you've just watched is that Apollo represents a Nordic type, right? So he represents a founding type. So, and this is the reason that people who are interested in Norse mythology should be getting behind Apollo, honestly, because he is the type, through all of kind of European mythology, including all the various myth bodies, he's this sort of definitive Nordic Aryan type, right?
He's the Hyperborean, right?
He is the Hyperborean. That was one of the epithets of Apollo, is that he was the Hyperborean. He came from Hyperborea, right?
Yeah.
So, so what I would recommend, and this is sort of something that the Romans were doing, so we basically be adopting a Roman practice or a Greek practice, that they would identify Apollo with local gods. But again, I would argue in some cases those local gods are actually really manifestations of Apollo, where that's what's being described, but just in a different language, right? But in any case, these local appearances of Apollo, you could retain those names, but it would be just a name like Granus Apollo. So we would understand that god to be Apollo. But if someone is like very interested in honoring sort of Celtic religion or Celtic myth, which I think has its problems, but it's but I think that really the correction there, because I think that we have to be sort of creative in myth development as opposed to passive and just receiving myth. We have to be able to develop religion and not just receive religion. And that's part of the idea of REM theory, right? Is that we're creating religion. And it's our religion. We're authoring it. We're not being given a religion, whether it's a Jewish religion or a religion of some other source. But what I would say is that really a reorienting of the Celtic pantheon, so that Dagda, for example, is not the chieftain god. And Dagda, modern mythologists associate Dagda with Pluto, even the god of the underworld. But probably more likely, he, to the extent that he was actually that much of a thing when the Romans were looking at the Celts, he was closest to Mercury, right? And that's also an association modern mythographers make. They associate him with Odin, so he's very similar to Odin in some regards. But there are other associations. Other people will jump in the chat and say, "Oh, he's like Hercules," or he's like, and yeah, these other, you can make other comparisons. So it's not a kind of one-to-one, but that. So he has attributes of other gods. He's a composite god, in fact, and that's an idea that I developed in my book. This idea of a composite god. Sort of kind of an important idea in a lot of ways. But we could just say, okay, well, just so long, we can, if you want to be like someone who's honoring, and again, I think that these cults are going to kind of disappear. I think that they're not real things, especially to the extent that they're sort of mystic cults. I think that these things will kind of die off because they're ridiculous on some level. And this is not a program for addressing the real problems in the world, which we have to address in a sober-minded way and not be, we can't become a superstitious people, for example, right? And that is the direction of some of this practice with, sort of the reverence of the ancient cults, is toward a kind of mysticism or superstition. And that is a kind of death path, I would say. That's not going to be useful or helpful for us, obviously, right? I mean, it's a way of kind of making yourself crazy. But I think that reorienting that pantheon so that we place a god like Granus at the head of that pantheon, or Granus Apollo at the head of that pantheon, and that would mean rewriting parables and rewriting new myths. If artists want to do that, to reorient that myth body and make that Celtic myth body more Apollonian, that would be a solution. But then, in a way, it would be sort of crypto-Apolloism. It would be a kind of inferior form of Apolloism, but maybe a way of talking to people who are interested in the aesthetics of, the Celts or whatever, right? So it becomes a way of god masking, or, creating art where, really, it's Apolloism, but you're inserting it in a more palatable way into a milieu where people are not ready for Apolloism. So it's a kind of true Apollonian phase, right?
Right. Okay, moving along. This is from Quex or QX. Apollo is considered the patron of same-sex love. That's the first I've heard of that. As he had many male lovers and was often invoked to bless homosexual unions. Is that statement true? I don't know.
It's not true. It's not true. So there are myths where he does have a homosexual lover, and the most salient one is a Spartan one. And it's this is something that the Spartans themselves are kind of an interesting, curious people that some suspect actually of having a Semitic element there, right? So there could be myths that were developed in a subversive way by the Spartans, for example, right? So that's one possible explanation to that. But so what we would regard that myth, maybe the myth is not proto-Jewish, maybe the myth is sort of degenerate. It's a degenerate myth that's being described. That would be a myth that we would discard or regard as non-canonical. But the truth is, of course, that Apollo was not the god of same-sex love. That's completely false, right?
Well, how could it be? How could it be eugenic and this god of same-sex unions, right? I mean, that's degenerate, if anything is. So, sorry, Quex. I mean, you might have to find something else, buddy.
Well, and the other thing I'll say too is that the god that was the god of same-sex love was Dionysius, right? So Dionysius actually had epithets that describe how he basically, epithets that from which the word androgynous derived, but mean actually that basically the guy went both ways, that he was a bisexual god. Those were actually epithets given to Bacchus or Dionysius, who was a god of degeneracy, effectively, and he was an antipode or kind of contrasted with Apollo as a god who was different from Apollo, right? We have this famous sort of dichotomy that is used by Nietzsche. That dichotomy existed in the ancient world and was understood in the ancient world, right? So Dionysius was a proto-Jewish god and Apollo was an Aryan god, right? So the person asking the question, I mean, and the other thing, we can look at how Jews function in society now and how Aryans function in society. Which of the two groups are interested in promoting homosexuality, right? I mean, the answer is very clear. Typically, Aryans, to the extent they do it, are degenerate or being kind of passive or being sort of led down the primrose path, as it would appear. Whereas Jews who have achieved a kind of culturally dominant position are ultimately the ones who are calling the shots culturally and are the ones who have basically approved the promotion of homosexuality, right?
Yeah, and in fairness to him, Quex, I think this is something that just seems to be really pushed in pop culture. I mean, you see this a lot with Romans in particular, right? Like, not to go off on a tangent, but I mean, they were a very ascetic, hardworking, military group of people, right? And I mean, they're constantly portrayed as, debauched and drunk and, decadent and whatever, right? And I mean, that's kind of a thing it's caught on in pop culture, and it's, it is what it is, right? But I mean, it's far from the origin.
Well, it should be, it should be the topic of a video. Let's be honest. I mean, because that's the kind of thing that will come up,
Yeah.
And in the other thing too, the other possibility or one possible direction this cult could go is that we would develop other names for Apollo to remove any kind of stigma that is attached to some ancient. And there are multiple ancient myths that are basically, whether or not they're not necessarily kind of explicitly degrading him, but they're humbling him. And one of them is the story that you see depicted in the film, the video that you've just seen, is his rejection by Daphne, his rejection by Cassandra. Right? These are ways of humbling the god, and they are in a way kind of subversive. They're a kind of artist making a subvert. The guy Apollo, who is the most powerful and most beautiful god in the Greco-Roman pantheon, is being rejected by some babes. And then and the other thing too is that one of the sort of myths or ideas with the Temple of Apollo was that Apollo would place the laurel tree at the center of the temple, so that there was this kind of longing for Daphne, who was this nymph that rejected him. this is, this is a kind of degenerate, this is a humbling of the god. And this wouldn't be a practice, right? So the homosexuality, but things like this would not be a practice. They would be deemed as non-canonical, possibly proto-Jewish in origin, or just degenerate, just bad ideas. I mean, that's the other thing too, is that this is not a cargo cult. We are, human beings who are sensible, and we can decide, well, actually, that's not, that parable is kind of degenerate, doesn't put our God in the right light. But to get to the other point that I was making is that maybe ultimately Apollo in a North American manifestation, for example, or wherever, or a global manifestation, would have a different, more common name that he's known by that would become more popular. But the reason that we have to hold on to all these myths is because we have to understand both how myth is developed in a salubrious way, but also how myth is made degenerate or subverted. Like we have to retain this information. So ultimately, the cult is Apolloism in the sense that, the knowledge comes from this knowledge of the Greco-Roman myth body and from really all the myth bodies of the world, but especially where we, have a Greek interpretation or Roman interpretation and can understand myths in a very coherent manner. We need to retain that. So we have to always retain a memory of Apollo, even if ultimately we decide to have another name, just so some idiot can't be like, oh, I think the guy was gay just because there was some subversive myth made about the guy like thousands of years ago. I mean, you could say the same about Jesus Christ, that he's gay based on some Netflix film that was made about the guy, right? That's another way to think of it.
That matter, right?
What's that?
Or anybody. I mean, it's really easy to take liberties with modern media, right?
Sure. Yep.
Yeah. I have to jump out now, so I'm going to pass the baton to MP Real.
Excellent. Thank you, Rick. Great questions. I'm sorry, I muted myself. I was going boomer level there for a second. So apologies for the boomer. So Imperial, can you unmute your mic?
Yeah, here I am. What's up?
Hey, sorry about that, man. So I was booming out. Sounds like you're in a vehicle of some type. Is that correct?
No problem.
Nice.
I am.
Can you can hear me though?
Yep, just tuning in.
Excellent.
Yep.
Excellent.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, we Apollonians work for a living.
Yeah. I just wanted to say. Yeah. For now, that's right. I just wanted to say, if anyone wants to do a quick search of Thebes on Wikipedia, it shows that Dionysius kind of introduced pederasty into the Hellenic world. And, all these myths with Apollo and Ganymede, with Zeus, it kind of got influenced by this Dionysian god. And it's a real quick search to see kind of the origins of this pederastic culture that was introduced.
Yeah, Imperial is a. Is that how you pronounce your name? Imperial. Yeah. Real?
Yeah, Imperial or Amp. Yeah, you can.
But Imperial is a real scholar. He's a kind of like just a guy who was. I don't think that you necessarily have an academic background in this stuff, but you have figured it out, and you've got a very good instinct for it, and you're very diligent in studying it. So, and you've come up with some great stuff. So that's what's needed now, because I mean, obviously the academy doesn't support work like the work we're doing, right?
Yeah.
So it's very valuable.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yes, it is. Yeah.
and you have a background in Christianity, which I has also been very
I do.
valuable. Because I think part of the solution to our puzzle actually does lie in Christianity, and lies in the Hebrew Bible, and lies in a sort of Jewish view of us in a lot of cases. That once you kind of decode it and you understand what's being said in these parables, a clearer picture not only of Jews emerges, but of ourselves, right? And I think in a lot of ways that they have a sort of deeper, more profound understanding of us than we do ourselves. And I think a lot of this is related to the fact that we are kind of without a religion, or we're blinded by religions that are not our own, of our own making. Whether there's sort of these secular religions developed by mainstream media, wokeism or whatever, or they're, these ancient religions of Christianity. They've kind of, they're kind of a way of blinding us in a way, I would argue, and a way of causing us to sort of lose our bearing. But that maybe not even ironically, but sort of naturally, and it sort of kind of makes sense that we would sort of find the answers in those religions, or part of the answer to kind of the direction forward for us, because we sort of can see what's being said in those religions about us, and also I think about the way to kind of deal with us and treat us. And I think that what is clear is that any competitor of us, or anyone that wishes us ill, sees an advantage in having us, think superstitiously or think mystically, and not think in a kind of sober-headed manner. And so I think that is one thing that's also revealed, is that they understand these religions like Christianity is a kind of blinding of us. And some of the parables actually even talk to that point directly, like the idea of Paul being blinded when he first sees Christ, and then later gaining a new vision 3 days later when the scales fall from his eyes. In any case, Martin, did you have any ideas or questions?
Yeah, got a few more from the chat, actually, regarding Christianity. We had a passionate question here about whether or not one would have to leave his or her Christian church that he or she is currently a member of. So I guess for someone who's interested in Apolloism, is there any compatibility there with Christianity?
I think I would say in the belief in Christianity, no. Right. So you would have to not believe in Christianity. I think that, people have talked about, one big concern with our project is that, well, you're going to alienate all the Christians, and all the people on the right, the vast majority of them are Christians, and we have to find a way not to alienate them. Well, my answer to that is that, that's not my role. My role is I'm sure people will, maybe they'll clip this or whatever, but I'm in a way a kind of rabbi of Apolloism, in the sense that I am a kind of radical, so I speak the truth. I'm explicit. But I think that there are roles for other Apollonians, but those roles do mean that they would not believe in Christianity, or believe in the truth of Christianity, which is that the miracles of the gospel, or that Christ, the Jewish Rabbi Christ, is our savior. You couldn't believe that. That would be incompatible with Apolloism, and Apolloism is incompatible with Christianity. I don't think you could be a true Christian and also be an Apollonian. That's impossible, right? So in other words, that is a form of idol worship. That's worshiping the golden calf, as it were. And that parable might even be a kind of reference specifically to a golden solar god like Apollo, if not Apollo himself. So you can't be a good Christian you can't be an Apollonian and a good Christian. So there's your answer right there. But also you can't be a good Apollonian and a Christian. But what you could, I do think that in this dawning phase of Apolloism, there is need for crypto Apollonians, effectively. This may be, for example, people who are, working with Christians, maybe even identifying as Christians, but who are Apollonians and whose, real sort of fealty is to the white race and to Apollo, who is the kind of the greatest symbol of the white race, I argue. And that argument is made in the video that you've just watched. So there is room for crypto-Apollonians. That would be in Christianity. That might be one example, but in the secular world in general. So artists who understand REM theory would be Apollonians and would be making art from an Apollonian perspective, to use one example. But people in general who identify as Apollonians would be living their lives as Apollonians, but would not necessarily be identifying as Apollonians. In a way, it's a kind of taqiyya, which Islam practices. But I think that we also have to be honest that there is also such a thing as crypto-Christians, and we've seen that as well. People who want to attack different belief systems like Apolloism, but don't want to make themselves open for attack, so they don't reveal that they are themselves Christians, for example, or that would be one reason for them to be crypto-Christians. So there is a role for crypto-Apolloism. These are kind of in an early phase, but the goal ultimately is that there would be no need for crypto-Apolloism, in the way that ultimately there was no need for crypto-Judaism. Or right now, Jews can be openly Jews and not feel threatened, or I'm sure that they argue now that there's rising anti-Semitism, but people identify proudly as Jews openly now, and that ultimately would be a goal. And there are some Apollonians now identifying openly as Apollonians, and that's a proud thing that people should be doing. Right now I'm still in a position where I'm, still putting myself in a position where I can openly identify as an Apollonian, but that day will come too. And I think that, but some people will not be able to openly identify as Apollonians, but we still need their help. And REM theory allows them to interact with the world in an esoteric, in a cryptic way that allows them to affect things while not being explicit. Anyways, Martin.
Well, I wanted to get maybe Jack's take on that too. Him being a former Christian, what would you tell to someone who was into Christianity but was interested in Apolloism as well?
Well, I'd first have to know the person, but ultimately I would ask them to look around at the world and kind of compare it to the Christ message, which is that basically we have received the foreigner, welcomed the stranger. We have loved our enemies into a position where we have kind of messed up civilization. I think if you look at the culture right now and you compare it to Christianity, there's a lot of post-Christians, is what I'd call them. And those post-Christians would be kind of like the George Floyd movement, where they've turned him into a martyr. And the BLM message fits perfectly with the Christian message. And the first will become last, the last will become first. Kind of during the civil rights movement, I would say that that kind of analogy with Rosa Parks, where she didn't want to sit at the back of the bus, but she wanted to be moved to the front of the bus, was a perfect opening for the civil rights movement and claiming the promises of the gospel, the social gospel, really, because the gospel can apply individually and people can become more pious or more virtuous. But socially, I would say that the social gospel does not apply to white people, because we are the privileged firstborns of our civilization. We will always be seen as the first not the last ones coming in. So the first will become last, and that's what we're seeing right now. And so it's you have a moral obligation to kind of step back and think about what this religion is doing to us, and what, where are we going, and where do we want to end up? What goals for our family? Do we want our sons to love our enemies? Do we want our sons to not be prideful of who they are, and do we want to forget our racial origins, our ethnic origins, racial origins, and are ultimately our name for our race? So I'd say that Apollo is just another name for our race. It's a collective euhemerization is what I would call it, and we kind of can see analogies in the Bible, like in the Tower of Babel. You had people that wanted to build a massive tower to the heavens, similar to the European architecture that we see.
Oh man, kind of gone robot on us there.
Yeah. I think he's in a vehicle
Yeah.
somewhere. So
Oh, no
I
problem.
believe
yeah.
Mark made a comparison. Oh, my bad.
Imperial.
problem.
we're
Thanks,
losing you, man.
moderator.
Hey man, no problem. No, that was a fantastic answer, man. We have some really good questions here, so I'm gonna kind of switch
Sure.
gears over to myth. Mark, isn't it also plausible that some of these quote unquote Semitic gods were created by Romans? Perhaps Python being an example.
Well, so really the question is, what do these symbols represent, right? So as in terms of like authorship, that we can look at each myth and sort of speculate as to what is the sort of the perspective, right? So if we take the example of Apollo slaying Python, for example, it seems like it's probably an Aryan perspective, right? So that myth may have an Aryan perspective. Let's take another example though. The Apollo being rejected by Daphne, for example. Now that might be, I would view that as a kind of degenerate myth in the sense that it's humbling God. It's humbling the God and should not be considered a canonical myth. But so that myth though may have a proto-Jewish origin, for example, right? So in other words, my thesis, and this is a kind of misconception, is that people, and generally it's my adversaries who are telling people not to pay attention to my work or whatever, but they're saying that I'm saying that Jews or proto-Jews invented all myth. That's obviously not the case, right? In fact, Apollo, the cult of Apollo, for example, I'm arguing was developed in a kind of conscious way to protect Aryan genes by Aryans, obviously, because Jews or proto-Jews would not be interested in doing that. So in the myth of Jupiter overthrowing Saturn, for example, a proto-Jewish god, or Typhon, who was also identified with Jews, with Yahweh in the ancient world. Jupiter overthrowing Typhon would be another example. So these myths were developed from an Aryan perspective. Now, but really the authorship is less important in my mind, because first of all, the authorship cannot be determined beyond beyond a reasonable doubt, or conclusively, rather. It cannot be determined conclusively. So I think that the more important question when we're looking at myth is not whether or not proto-Jews or Aryans developed the myth, but really what is the myth saying? Is it a salubrious myth that is valuable to us? And also, what do these characters or symbols represent? What does Jupiter represent? What does Apollo represent? What does Mercury represent? What does Bacchus represent? So those become more important questions. So if the person asking the question is wondering, well, did some Roman artist or religion developer develop the character of, or actually, let's go to the Greeks, develop Hermes as a Semitic figure, as a reference, basically, to Semites? Sure. I mean, that is possible. Certainly that's possible. But I think you see my point. The important thing is not who developed the myth ultimately, though I think it is important to recognize that a lot of these myths have basically a proto-Semitic or rather proto-Jewish perspective that's important to realize. But the more important question is, what does Jupiter represent? What does Apollo represent? What does Daphne represent? What does, I think you get my point. Vulcan represent?
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. It's more about REM is about interpretation. So that was we got 6 more here. Keep them coming, guys. This next one is I'm gonna let you go whichever way you want to go with it, Mark. It's okay. Do you see polygamy becoming prevalent amongst Apollonians in increasingly degenerate conditions with our understanding of religion and your bride gathering thesis? Is polygamy going to be all the rage, Mark, among Apollonians?
Well, so I think that the question, though, because he's talking about the bride gathering thesis, I do think that religions are bride gathering cults. Like, so in other words, Apolloism would also be a bride gathering cult in the sense that it's a eugenics cult, and I think that marriage and reproduction is obviously very important, and this is a kind of task of religion is but I think also in the case of Apolloism, like matching good couples would be part of it as well, because if we're thinking eugenically here, for example. But as to the question of polygamy, because we do, obviously there are myths where Jupiter or Zeus has multiple wives, or not multiple wives, but he has multiple lovers. Well, I mean, there's a couple of dimensions to that. One, I think that, again, these, in many cases, these can be subversive myths that we wouldn't regard as canonical myths that are painting the gods in a bad light. And this is something, of course, that like even, Plato talks about that myths, maybe myths should not, these are questions that are asked in works like the Republic, should there be parables, or should Homer, for example, be acceptable because it has these sort of degenerate elements in it. So, again, a myth, Homer, for example, or these kind of subversive myths become valuable to us as scholars, as people learning Roman interpretation, for example, and should be preserved because of that. They just should be understood. And they should be presented alongside analysis and taught with analysis. But to get to the question, will this cult? Well, first of all, I guess I'll answer the question: do I think that polygamy is a good thing? No, I don't. I don't think that polygamy is. I don't think that we should become a polygamous people. I don't. People have this idea that well, what if the sort of the well-born, or the sort of very eugenic, the beautiful, the intelligent, the strong, what if they're allowed to have many wives? I think that ultimately that system fails. Because I do think that we should be thinking eugenically, but I think that I think that women deserve to be treated well, and I think that that's part of a virtue cult. Apolloism would be a virtue cult in that regard, is that women, that this is not a cult all about sort of the whims or pleasures of men, for example. It's about, it's a cult of duty, and that you would be ideally loyal to your wife. And this is something that, look, I mean, obviously people have divorces, and, sometimes you'll have a second wife and things happen. And I don't think that we should have a sort of dramatic or superstitious or Christian view of like people going to hell because of things like this. But I think that ideally, people are monogamous, and they have they pair for life. Ideally, I would argue, and I think that that is a kind of trait of our. I would make that argument in recommendation in this cult. That is a trait of Aryans in general. It appears is that we tend to be monogamous, whereas I think as conditions become polygamous, they are also becoming non-white in a way. And we see polygamy, for example, in the Arab world, So we have to wonder what is the origin of that? And Apollonians also have this understanding that Aryans are, at least in the civilizational context, that we are firstborn, that we're founders, and that often, for example, in the Middle East, we are looking at civilizations that were Aryan in their origin, whether they're speaking at their origin, Indo-European languages or Semitic languages. That's not race. That these civilizations obviously have Aryan, or these civilizations typically have Aryan foundings of martial people who are kind of gifted in this role of creating civilization, as it were, and that the degeneration process is ultimately a process of becoming non-white, and that so that we, even as polygamy develops among whites in degenerating conditions, we probably see the beginning or the origin of a polygamy that will be continued, for example, in non-white worlds, such as the Arab world, for example, right? So I guess that's my answer.
All right. Let's talk influences. In terms of what helped you form Apolloism, were there any particular books that helped you get to some of your ideas? Any influences from Arthur de Gobineau or William Pierce, or any particular books that helped you form Apolloism?
Yeah, Gobineau was influential, definitely. So I think he was influential in my view generally, but he was mostly influential. Sorry, I had to clear my throat. He was mostly influential in this idea of an Aryan founding thesis, right? Which is a thesis that he held, which I think ultimately to be the correct thesis, and it is a thesis that's been furthered by other academics. One contemporary academic, who was criticized because. And I can't really vouch for all his work, but I think that the general upshot of his work is correct. Arthur Kemp is one guy that is sometimes criticized because he's basically sort of outside of the mainstream academia for very obvious reasons. But I think he also has the correct idea that basically what we're looking at with early civilizations commonly, and maybe not in every case, but in many salient and important cases, and even including in some surprising cases, and even including in the Far East, for example, that we find an earlier Aryan founding group that, through a kind of cyclical, I don't even know if the term is cyclical because it only has one direction, but through a rather, I guess, through an urbanizing process, especially, the group becomes non-white because it degenerates effectively, and non-white groups become prevalent. So I basically accepted that as part of my thesis, but I can't really say that I have really done much work furthering that thesis, except that I've accepted it. I mean, I think that the only thing that really that I guess I have found corroboration for that thesis in myth, and in that way I've furthered it. But I think that generally the approach, like Arthur Kemp's approach, is more of a kind of archaeological approach, or people are looking at genetic remains. And I actually think that the mythological record is actually in some ways more reliable. But in the myth, I think that that story is also told, and so my role has been a kind of corroboration of a thesis that's been that I didn't develop, but I think that I'm able to corroborate in mythological ways. But I think that the thesis that I did develop is this idea of a proto-Jewish closer of civilizations, which I think is also in the myth record. So, and I think that helps to complete the picture. So you start with an Aryan founder thesis, and then you have a closer thesis, which is the proto-Jewish closer, right? So that's what I would argue. But yeah, their work was definitely valuable to me, and I've accepted their general premise.
So building off the closer theory, what steps would you take, or what steps should be taken in the future to prevent the contamination of Apolloism?
Well, so that's a very interesting question. And that's, I mean, I think that ultimately we have to accept that at its origin that we do have to kind of develop a sort of dogma, as it were. So we have to kind of fix some things in place. And I think that one of the things that, we may have to, for example, the homosexual question that comes up, we may have to develop some early myths that basically show kind of explicitly Apollo rejecting, a homosexual lover or something like that. And maybe, and ideally it's not in some overly violent way, but maybe it's in a way where a lover is rejected by Apollo and then, has a tragic fate like Narcissus and dies looking at his own reflection or something, or dies some lonely death and Apollo has rejected him, something like that. That might be a myth that we regard as a kind of salubrious myth, indicating, in one of the ways that we could make it a kind of definitive myth is maybe the name of the character, this homosexual character, for example. I'm spitballing here as an idea for a parable. The name of this homosexual character could be actually a reference to homosexuality, so that the myth becomes very clear that Apollo is rejecting not only this figure, but homosexuality itself. And I don't know exactly what that, we'd have to come up with some clever, cool name. But that would be an example of, making a myth that would sort of help safeguard, but also the development of canonical myths. So we would establish canonical myths and we would find a way of preserving this list of canonical myths. And this would be myths that we would develop, but also myths in the ancient world that we would regard as canonical. And maybe we would even have some myths that are better than others that we consider better, but not ideal, right? Because I think that there are some gray areas and gradations there. So we could even kind of have a ranking of myths, as it were. But then again, these degenerate myths have value as well, because there are these kind of striking lessons that appear in these degenerate myths, where I argue often from a kind of proto-Jewish or even crypto-Jewish, and in the modern world, Jewish perspective of the Aryan, we gain insight because the Jew has insight into the Aryan psychology and understands him in a lot of ways better than he understands himself. So there is value in the study of Jewish art, whether proto-Jewish art in the ancient world or the Hebrew Bible or Christianity or contemporary Jewish films. But some dogmas. So what are some dogmas? Well, one dogma I think that we need to establish is that Apollo is a synonym of the Aryan race. So that becomes his definition. And then, then what's the goal of the Apollonians? Well, the ultimate goal of Apollonians is to protect Apollo and further and strengthen and ameliorate Apollo, right? So if these become dogmas at the founding of the cult, and then from there we can go, well, okay, homosexuality is not something that we'll tolerate in the cult. So we're not going to persecute homosexuals. I don't think that, I think in a lot of cases they have no, control or no role in whether deciding they're homosexuals. And so it's not a matter of persecuting, but that, homosexuality is not a practice that's sort of allowed in the cult. That is something that is Bacchus, or the domain of Bacchus. Anyways.
Well, speaking of who's allowed in the cult, this was one question we got. Someone with a friend who's half white, half Korean, is a white racialist and is interested in Apolloism. Would such a person be welcomed into Apolloism?
Well, yeah. So I think that we start to enter into this idea of polytheism, right? So a guy like that, or let's say the guy's a half Jew, or he's a quarter Jew, or something like that. Who knows? Maybe even a full Jew. I think that, but he doesn't. We're convinced that he is actually for the interests of whites, and that we've become convinced of that. Through whatever process we decide that he's someone who's in favor of our cult, and he's not trying to subvert us. I think that we then designate people like this mercurials, right? So they're not part of the cult Apollo itself, but they are part of a herald class or part of a mercurial class that is subservient to the Apollonian cult and is looking out for the Apollonian cult. And that is its priority. It doesn't have any other priority. So Apollo, the cult of Apollo becomes the cult it venerates, and it serves Mercury serves his brother Apollo, and as in Homer, he swears or vows never to steal the flock from his house again. And stealing the flock from the house again would be a reference, for example, to, Jewish bride gathering, or, trying to, trying to basically, thieve genes from Aryans to ameliorate themselves at our expense, for example, right? So, but Mercury or Hermes does have a positive manifestation in some of the myths, but these cults, they can serve us and they can gain some benefit actually from serving us, serving what would become a nascent nobility ultimately in Apollonians. They can gain some benefit in it, and they can gain some protection from being good servants. They cannot be us or part of us, but they can nevertheless have a good existence in the Apollonian world and serve some end that we deem beneficial. I guess that's, I was going to say something else, but it kind of I forgot what I was going to say. But obviously that type exists. It's a tiny minority. Mercury and Hermes is the deceiver. We know that from myth. So to the extent he deceives, he would be deceiving our enemies. To the extent he just starts deceiving us, he loses his job as, being related to us or gaining any advantage, and we understand him as adversarial. He becomes oppositional. But the fact that designation of Mercury as the deceiver also gives us instruction in how to relate to these people and understand that they are ultimately deceivers, right? In the sense that, but because they're trying to serve their own ends at our expense, right? So provided that, but that's not the case with all of them. Obviously, there's some minority.
Yeah, definitely. Got just a couple more here. Let's see. This is another one, kind of from like a Christian background. The interior life, like prayer or contemplation, is of preeminent importance in Christian tradition. What is, if any, the role of prayer in Apolloism?
Well, again, I think that ritual is important, and this is something we're in a kind of early phase of Apolloism. So what exactly that looks like, I mean, I think that we have initiation rituals, we have, we have ceremonies. Again, apologies, clearing my throat. One, for example, is the Thargelia, right? This is something that Apollonians who are in the group, the Apollonian group chat are familiar with, is that, but it is a kind of, it's actually referenced as well in the film that was just shown, is that Thargelia is basically the exclusion of non-eugenic types from from the Apollonian flock, as it were. Now, what that looks like in the modern world is going to be a little different than what it supposedly looked like in the ancient world, which, it is mixed in with myths. So no one knows exactly what that ritual was, how much of it was kind of symbolic and how much of it was kind of actual, as it were. But the ritual itself becomes valuable in the sense that it is, I think that they probably, this idea that you could always be kicked out of Apolloism, I think is a valuable idea, that you have to be not criminal, you have to be not deceitful. And also that there has to be some standard of physical fitness, I think, ultimately. And also there is a kind of racial criteria, which is related to beauty. And this is something that Jews understand as well. In fact, Imperial knows all this stuff as well, because he studies this very closely. But the god, or not the god, the biblical figure of Japheth, who is one of the sons of Noah, his name, the Hebrew name, when given a different vocalization, means beauty, but it's the same name. So it's the same name as beauty. Japheth means beauty, but Japheth is also the father of the Europeans. He's understood as symbolically as the god of the Europeans, some equivalent of Apollo or Jupiter, let's say, especially Apollo, I would say. So beauty is a Aryan trait, right? So and so if we have we have some understanding of the Thargelia from ancient records that the ugly are being excluded, we also understand that there's a kind of racial and eugenic aspect to that, right? And and I think that that's also, it's this idea of forming a nobility too. I mean, we're not just trying to form we're not just trying to protect whites in their degenerate form, as we're trying to improve whites eugenically, right? So that there is, we want to create groups ultimately that are exclusionary and that people can be excluded from, whether for moral reasons, because they're not compatible with Aryan morality, or for ultimately genetic reasons. In a lot of cases, it's sort of like no hard feelings, right? In example would be the cult of Mercury, for example, that they're not to call them dysgenic might be a little too harsh, but they're not Aryans effectively. And our goal is to protect Aryans, right? And I think that another example would be, because obviously Jews, for example, are very intelligent and have very good traits. So to call them dysgenic by itself is not telling the full story. It's too dismissive or too incomplete in its sort of description. But another cult that I think should be developed as well is the cult of Mars. And the cult of Mars is distinct from the Apollonian cult, I argue. It also describes an Aryan type, but it describes a more common type, whose rights also should be protected and whose interests also should be protected. And in a way, they're servile to the Apollonian cult. But the Apollonian cult also serves the martial cult in the sense that the interests of both are aligned. And that there is kind of movement between the different cults in the sense that the martials can move up into the Apollonian cult and become Apollonians, through a kind of eugenic process, but also in a breeding process in breeding in the sense of good breeding in the sense of education and educational development, for example, and also accomplishment, achieving things, achieving greatness, doing things that are useful for Aryans. These are things that can make you Apollonian, I would argue, or that should be a system that develops. So once a kind of nobility develops, a nascent nobility right now, Apollonians have no power. So it is really a kind of nascent form. And what in Apolloism right now exists in the way that Marxism, for example, existed before communism. It's a idea for people to take and to develop and to make a reality, right? So I'm not arguing that the guys on this podcast right now, we're the nobles, dude. We're the aristocrats. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that this represents the direction toward that. And but I'm getting off track here, obviously. So, but getting back to the martial cult, so there can be a symbiosis between two cults, where one cult is a kind of feeder of another cult, if that makes sense to you. And both cults, the interests of both cults are aligned. There's hierarchy there. There's the nobility, the kings versus the warrior caste, as it were. But they're not just warriors. They're the useful members of the society, the laborers, the people who are the yeomen, the people who are the backbone in a lot of ways, the body of the society, as opposed to the brain of the society. Anyways, that's a kind of long-winded response.
No, that's great. One more about some of your influences. What was your opinion of Oswald Spengler and Decline of the West? I know you've talked about the seasons of civilization. If you want to go off on that for a minute.
Yeah. I'm kind of as people may or may not know, I'm a little bit of a rejecter of Spengler in the sense that I think that there's a great deal of passivity to his thesis. You could argue that there's an explanatory value. I would argue against that, but that he basically describes a known phenomena that we're all familiar with, that civilizations rise and they decline. But I think that I think his view, though, is ultimately they're not. Though this is maybe a kind of imperfect, because I think I don't think this is totally a fair piece. But the general view, I think, is that he views civilizations as these kind of organic things that are in a way kind of mindless, in the way that, like, one of the famous metaphors that he uses is that civilization is like a plant that rises up from the soil. So it has a kind of unconscious manifestation, then it has a life, it has a seasons, it has cycles, and then it dies. It has a spring, and then it inevitably has a winter, and it dies. Now, and actually, he might have actually made this exception with Rome, because I think he does indicate that Rome was, in some sense, a kind of conscious will to power. But I think it's also the case with Greece as well. But what myth, in the way that religion and myth was developed, in times previous to Greece and Rome, but especially they reached a kind of refinement in Greece and Rome, was this idea that they were using religion to actually kind of control the seasons, I would argue, through their metaphors. And the important god there is Saturn, who again is a proto-Jewish god, who is a kind of synonym of Yahweh. So what's revealed there is my thesis. I'm reading the myth, so I'm taking a thesis that, may have been I think was kind of a known idea to the developers of Roman and Greek mythology, was that Cronus is Cronus or Saturn, the same god, a god that means time, right? So the idea that Jupiter overthrows Saturn, and it also means seasons, right? So the idea that Jupiter overthrows Saturn is the idea of him overthrowing the seasons or overthrowing time. That's how he becomes immortal. And the idea that the metaphor that the Romans developed is that Jupiter puts Saturn in chains to control the seasons, right? So that Aryans gain control of the seasons. And what are these seasons? Well, they're civilizational seasons, right? They're describing the rise and decline of civilizations. And so that they developed in the metaphor of their religion a way of addressing this problem of decline. Now, obviously, they were unsuccessful, and the cult that ultimately defeated Rome and the Greco-Roman world was Christianity. And I would argue because it was the most subtle of the cults, the most subtle of the chthonic cults. It was basically a kind of sublimated Bacchus cult, and that's the way. Anyways, that's a long-winded answer.
All right, we have just two more here. Getting back into myth, Mark, is the god Balder the equivalent of Apollo?
No. His
okay.
Yeah. His closest equivalency is Jesus Christ or Adonis, right? He's a dying and rising god. He's this god that's slain by Loki. And he goes into the underworld. I think he even goes in for, if I'm not mistaken, he goes in for 3 days. Maybe that's incorrect. But the exact duration that Christ goes into hell, right? And he also goes into hell. Adonis goes into hell. And he emerges from hell. And there's an apocalypse called the Ragnarok, which is very similar to Christianity. And at the end of the apocalypse, Balder returns and sets up a new world, much like New Jerusalem that Christ sets up in a Revelation. So what's happening in that myth is that Christianity is being referenced in Norse mythology. That's what I argue. So Christianity is being referenced in Norse mythology, which tells us that at the very least, Christianity predates those particular myths in Norse mythology. And I don't think it's a corruption. I think that these myths are sort of central to Norse mythology. No, that's what you could even make the argument that Norse mythology is in a way a kind of Christian rock, or it's a way of disguising the sort of subversive themes in Christianity and presenting them to a Viking or pagan audience. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that it's a kind of esoteric gloating of the process of the Christianization of Aryans through this metaphor told, in Norse mythology. It's kind of esoteric rendering of the process of Christianization, because in that myth we see that the gods all die, all the Norse gods die, and in the end it's Balder. It's Balder, who is a Christ figure, a Christ symbol, right?
All right. This is a good one here to probably wrap up on, specifically about the video. Let's see. Don't remember who these were from. Kind of a combo here. But okay, wouldn't Norse frost giants be more closely aligned to giants, titans, cyclops of Greek myth? Someone else had a note that the defeat of the frost giants is more a myth about emancipation from the, quote, tyranny of nature, unquote, and the harsh climate. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I disagree. So, sometimes these analyses are coming from people who are themselves racialists. So it's sort of curious that, and I think that my analysis of myth is more explanatory and makes more sense, that basically when you see these sort of different tribes or races of giants and dwarves or whatever in these myths fighting against each other, that you're actually seeing races, a description of different races fighting against each other. And that these races also have an analog in the real world. And that they're not explaining, like, Vulcan is not explaining volcanoes, like, Vulcan, that myth, for example, is very sophisticated. And that is, I argue, is a reference to the same god that's described at Mount Sinai, who is also a volcano god. So it is a reference to the Jewish god, and in a crypto form or in a proto-Jewish form. And Israeli archaeologists are even coming to that conclusion, or revealing that to us now, saying that it's likely that the Yahweh cult emerged from basically a Vulcan cult, or a Canaanite Vulcan cult. So they're writing papers, like Israeli archaeologists are writing papers like that now. But the Jewish esotericists in contemporary arts make references to Vulcan as a Jewish figure, for example. So that's another bit of evidence, and I argue in my work that Professor X would be one example. He's in a wheelchair, just like Vulcan was in a wheelchair, and he also has an assistant. Just like Vulcan had a forge assistant named Cyclops, right? So that becomes a reference to Greco-Roman myth, and Professor Xavier he's a Jewish figure, just like Magneto. Written, and this describes the Caducean, written by a very Jewish thinking guy named Stan Lee, who knew the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, forwards and backwards, effectively, based, when you analyze his myth body. Anyways, what was it? So, but as it concerns frost giants in particular, so there are these giants in the ancient world that might, the giants in the ancient world that oppose the Olympians, for example, are distinct. They are distinct from, one of the symbols. If you look at the art of those giants in the ancient world, in the ancient Greek world, I'll admit that I haven't analyzed them carefully, but one clue, and so I'm spitballing here, and I don't know if this is actually the right reading, but one possible interpretation of those giants is that they have these serpentine legs. They're often depicted with these serpentine legs, and the serpent in general becomes a reference in the myth. He becomes a symbol. The serpent becomes a symbol of Dionysius, becomes a symbol of Hermes. He becomes the symbol of in the Greek world, he becomes a symbol of Typhon, becomes a symbol of Python, of course, and that is ultimately a Semitic or Eastern symbol, right? It describes Easternness. So it's possible that those giants have a different significance in that myth body than the giants do in the Norse myth body, which in the Norse myth body, they don't have that serpentine trait. I'm referring specifically to frost giants, right? So the element that's important there is this idea of frost. They come from northern realms. They're these northern types, effectively. And there are other giants that may have a different significance in that myth body that I think do probably have a different significance in that myth body, and they're called fire giants, and they come from a different realm, Surt. In fact, I think Surt and maybe I'm incorrect, so someone can correct me, but if I'm remembering correctly, I think that Surt, the etymology of Surt might even be black or dark, and he's the chieftain of these fire giants, right? So the fire giants have a different significance, but they're also giants, right? So you can't look at the myths in a sort of like blunt way and be like, okay, giant here, giant mean that. You have to look at it in a kind of more analytical and closer way. So frost giants. So when I'm talking about giants in the myth, I'm talking in particular about frost giants. I'm not talking about fire giants, for example. Anyways.
All right. Let's go with this for the last question here. Saturn or Yahweh being some fundamental force that has to be overthrown in the Greek mythology seems to give it more power than I think is salubrious. Thoughts? Yahweh should be looked on with contempt.
No, I don't. I think that's absurd. I mean, what are you talking about? I mean, does the author think that Jews are not powerful? I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, they're definitely the most powerful group on the planet right now. There's no one even close. And, or at least as far as a religion or ethnic group goes, I mean, you could argue that the white race is still the most powerful, but it's not. It possesses the most power, but it doesn't use power in any kind of directed fashion or to its own ends, right? So it's a kind of degenerating and dying group that doesn't direct power, but Jews do direct power, and they are the most powerful ethnic group. So, yeah, I think you give respect to adversaries and you don't disrespect them, because that's how you lose. I mean, it's a kind of, if you're playing a football game, you don't look at the adversary and be like, oh, these guys are chumps. But the other thing too is that Jupiter ultimately dominates Saturn and places him in chains. So it is a very moralizing description ultimately, but it gives respect to Saturn, and Saturn deserves respect because he's a powerful god, and he's one to be viewed as a powerful god, and not one to be like, this guy's some chump. And any white nationalist is saying that, it's just absurd. It's not even,
Well, last question from the chat. Mark from Yehuda Finkelstein. What are your thoughts on Vulcan?
So he may have heard. Yeah. So Vulcan again is akin, in my view, and I already kind of described this, but Israeli archaeologists are also coming to this conclusion. There's some evidence in contemporary gem, which I've gone into one example, that he basically is a Jewish god or a proto-Jewish god, and I think that he is thrown out. So there's an expulsion myth with Vulcan. He's thrown out of Olympus, and for very interesting, the two reasons are given in two sort of salient versions of the tale. One is that he's deformed or he's ugly, so he's thrown out for that reason. The other, which is kind of more sympathetic reason, I mean, that's pretty rough, but it's also consistent with the idea of the thargelia, or a kind of eugenic interest or instinct among the ancients. The other reason that he's thrown out, which is a kind of very insightful reason, is that he is a kind of proto-male feminist, in the sense that he's protecting, or I believe it's in Homer. Yeah, he's protecting Hera, or Juno, from Jupiter, right? So there's a battle of the sexes happening between the Queen of Heaven and the King of Heaven, and this Semitic proto-Jewish figure is inserting himself between the two and defending the woman against the man. So it almost reads as a kind of he's a kind of proto-male feminist character, which resonates with us because we can kind of see Jews in that role as well. And another example, or another reason why this reading is correct, or is, I believe to be correct, is corroborated by the story of Athena's birth, or Minerva's birth. She is midwifed by Vulcan's axe. So Vulcan uses his axe to cut open Jupiter's head, and wisdom emerges out of Jupiter's head. And we look at that as some benign ancient story, but what also another reading, what also could be describing, is also a kind of lobotomizing of Jupiter, right? So Jupiter's in a way being kind of lobotomized, and wisdom is being taken out of him and is given another identity, which is a female identity. So wisdom becomes a woman as opposed to a male, right? And this happens because Vulcan is the one who does this effectively. And so I think that is also another curious myth that sort of reveals the character or nature of Vulcan. One thing I'll say on this point, because I think that there probably will be some, and rightly, I think that women will also be interested in Apolloism. That we don't view figures like Athena or Minerva in an antagonistic light. We think that she ultimately becomes a salubrious figure in the sense that she is servile to Jupiter, and she becomes a kind of loyal daughter of Jupiter. And she, as a figure, as a type, I think is attractive. And I think she describes a type among our race, a female type among our race. All of these, goddesses are archetypes, and they describe types of women among our race. And I think she is a valuable type. We Apollonians are aware of a Minerva. Ketamine girl is a kind of Minerva, and she's a very valuable type, a very intelligent, and she's among the best scholars of the Apollonians in terms of like figuring this stuff out. So we value, or we venerate her as as a person and as a type. But most women fit into kind of a more Venus type. That's a kind of every woman type, which is more connected to reproduction and sexuality. And there are types in the ancient world. There are forms or versions of Venus. You could say that she has both her good aspect and, not to place a value judgment on it, but so let's just say her promiscuous aspect. She also has a promiscuous aspect. Pandemos is what they call it. Pandemos means Venus. Pandemos is Venus of the demos, or of the people. So she has a more earthly or promiscuous aspect. And this is Venus who's been severed from Uranus or from Caelus by Saturn's scythe, right? So she becomes, and that's also revealing Saturn is in some ways, making the daughter of Uranus or of the Aryans promiscuous or degenerate. So she has different forms, and she's kind of rehabilitated in some of these forms. One of the forms is Urana, right? Connecting her to the celestial as opposed to the earthly. And I think the Romans in particular were interested in rehabilitating Venus and making her the kind of natural mate of Mars as opposed to the mate of Bacchus and Mercury and these Semitic figures. And so in Rome, we see a conscious propagandistic effort to make Mars and Venus a couple, as opposed to Mars, being the one who cuckolds Vulcan, who's the actual husband of Venus or Aphrodite. So what I would say there is that so we see examples of a rehabilitation of a god or goddess in that case, and there were even virgin cults of Venus, right? Which is evident that were in part inspired nuns, for example, in the Christian church, right? So there are forms of virgin Venus, just like there's forms of, or just like there is Virgin Mary, just like the Virgin Mary becomes a thing. So, and Virgin Mary is derived in part from this cult of the Virgin Venus. You see ways in this. Also goes back to the question of, well, what about these myths, these subversive myths about Apollo being a homosexual or whatever? Well, again, those gods can be rehabilitated, and they can be given new myths, and they can be given canonical myths as opposed to degenerate or non-canonical myths. I don't know if I went off track on that one, but whatever. I think it seemed like it was valuable.
Yeah, very good. Very good questions, everyone. We'll wrap it up there. Mark, where can people go to support this film series or the rest of your work?
Yeah, well, right now, so at the end of I think it's REM, is it remtheory.net? it's in the description of the videos, right? So the link is in the description of videos, so you can link to a place to support the film series. So that's what I would say about that. So please go there and support it. I mean, I think it's a very valuable project. I mean, this is a revival cult, so we're bringing back something that I think will be. I mean, the way that I describe Apolloism is that it's less a revelation and more a deduction. It's more a kind of deducement in the sense that it's understanding, what the correct path is forward in terms of what gods and symbols we should be attaching ourselves to, as opposed to me having or someone else having some religious revelation that Apollo is the true god or whatever. So, I mean, that's how I would describe it. And I think it will catch on. I mean, I think right now it's and hopefully Bitcoin remains strong, but I would say right now it's a sort of Bitcoin of religions. So people should get in on it and support it. Definitely.
All right, Jack, any last wisdom to toss in? Still there? Yeah.
Oh no, yeah, I'm still here. Don't know if I'm breaking up, but yeah, thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. Thanks, Zorch, as well, the guy who made did the editing for the video.
Yeah. Hail Zorch.
Hail Zorch.
Ave Apollo.
And hail Apollo, definitely. All right, guys. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time. Hopefully, people will find this stream valuable. If we get good feedback on this stream, we'll do more streams in the future. All right. Goodbye, guys.
All right. Thanks, Mark.